Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Welcome to Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Okay, we've been working for the last 6 weeks. This is the sixth video in a series of shows we've been doing on a book I wrote called God's Crime Scene. And the idea here is to be able to look at the universe, not as though God has committed a crime, which you're about to see in a minute, that's not my point of the book, but look at the universe as you would look at any death scene or crime scene or investigative scene. There are certain principles that we use at crime scenes that I think do apply to what we're looking at in the area of the universal cosmic scene of the universe, the natural room of the universe. We've been taking an approach that is very simple. It's a game we play at death scenes called Inside or Outside the Room, and we simply ask the question, can I explain everything I see in the room by staying in the room? If I can, then there's not going to be an intruder involved. More than likely, this is not going to be a murder. And I talk about this at much length in the prior episodes leading up to today's episode. And if you're behind or haven't seen some of those, please go to our coldcasechristianity.com website. Go to the top toolbar on the right-hand side. You'll see the link for YouTube. And if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll see that all of these episodes have been archived for your viewing pleasure. So you can go back and catch up and kind of see what you've already missed. Now today, we're going to talk about the summary of the 8 pieces of evidence we've been looking at in the room of the universe and trying to draw the most reasonable inference. Can we explain these by staying in the room, or do we have to go out of the room for an explanation? And today what I hope to do in this last episode is to give you a skill set, which is really particular, and I'll talk about when we come back from the video. It's a skill set that really we do use in criminal trials all the time. And I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, but a lot of the video and the multimedia that you're seeing in this presentation is very similar to the multimedia that I use in criminal trials. As a matter of fact, I developed this process, this approach, over years and years of doing these in front of juries, and I've just kind of transferred this now into my work as a Christian case maker. So the kind of presentation you're about to see and how we compare explanations, we often would do this kind of comparison of explanations between what we as a prosecuting team would say compared to the defense team. So you're going to see an approach that's very similar to what we actually do in criminal trials. I hope it's helpful to you. But what you're going to see here, at least in this first step, is you're going to take a look and see, well, how do we make the case? How do we make a circumstantial case? And what are the elements that are involved? And why do we think that the best explanation is X, let's say, as opposed to Z? And so you're going to see an approach here that I think will help you. It's going to stand firmly on a couple of simple principles. When you're making the case for anything, including the case for God's existence, the more pieces of evidence you have, of course, the better the case, the more cumulative. And you'll notice in my book, every chapter of my book, I'm really trying to teach you that one principle. The strongest way to make the case for design in biology, the case for the mind or for free agency, the case for fine-tuning of the universe is to make it cumulatively. This is the nature of all of my cases criminally in front of juries. We do cumulative cases, and there's some great advantages to doing a cumulative case approach. If I've only got one witness who saw you or saw my suspect involved in a potential crime, then all the defense has to do is knock down that one witness, find a way to make that witness look like he or she is not credible in front of a jury, and he will actually accomplish the goal because he'll be able to remove or eliminate the one piece of evidence I'm able to bring. But if I've got hundreds of little pieces of evidence that build toward the same conclusion, that's a much more difficult case to defend. And actually, it's the way that things really happen. For the most part, there's always lots, and I always say this, if you want to know what counts as evidence, and you've seen it in the last few weeks in this presentation, it turns out everything counts as evidence. What's in the room always counts as evidence. What could have been in the room but isn't also counts as evidence. What he said counts as evidence. What he could have said but didn't counts as evidence. It turns out Everything has a cumulative, circumstantial impact on the larger case. And that's what you're going to see now as we begin this video. This is a video that originally was an hour and 40 minutes long. It was taken at Colleyville, Texas, at a church called Compass Church. Great folks who are really interested in making the case for what they believe. And you're going to see here the very end of my presentation in which I'm summarizing all the things we talked about along the way in making the case for God's existence. And I hope it'll help you to come away with a better understanding of how to make a robust, cumulative case for God's existence, the same way you make that kind of a case for any kind of criminal trial. So let's get started here with the very end of this presentation of God's crime scene.
Oh my gosh. I give you all graduate degrees right now in God's crime scene, okay? You all get a graduate degree. We start off with this analogy, and we said, hey, how do we turn this into another analogy about whether it's a good explanation inside or outside the box? And we looked at 8 pieces of evidence that I think have to be explained by everyone. That burden of proof is not just on you theists, it's on the atheists who say I can get this some other way too. And I think if you look at this, that the best explanation that's available to us is not inside, it's outside. And that changes everything. Remember, when I go to a crime scene and I see pieces of evidence in the crime scene, those pieces of evidence tell me something about my suspect. And in fact, the same thing happens here because each piece of evidence has to be accounted for by one suspect. Whatever it is that gives you the beginning of the universe also has to give you consciousness. Can your multiverse generator do that? Can your multiverse generator give you a standard for moral and tough? Remember, whatever accounts for this has to account for all this. What's my suspect here? It's not Mick Jagger, okay? Mick can't account for this stuff. He got arrested in 1967, but he can't account for this. Why? Because this requires a different suspect that I could actually begin to describe based on the evidence. I'm looking for a non-spatial, atemporal, non-material, purposeful, directional, informational, communicative, this purposeful, creative, conscious mind who has the freedom to act freely and become the standard for all moral good, and even the standard by which we judge something as evil. I'm looking for that kind of suspect. He can't do that for me. But there is a suspect that could do that for me. That would be God. The classic definition we have of Yahweh happens to fit the bill. Now, when I did this case with the guy with the garrote, years later, I took him to jail. And when I took him to jail, I took him for good reason because I had some eyewitness testimony. I had some behavioral stuff that people saw back in 1979 that implicated him. I also had some physical evidence that came back to him. And I also had some statements he made which implicated him. So when I have lots of pieces of evidence that point to the same suspect, and not only that, they're in very different kinds of categories, holy smokes, that's the best kind of case. Because I've got lots of pieces of evidence in different categories. It turns out the same thing happens here with this case we built for God. Lots of pieces of evidence in different categories. 2 that are purely cosmological, 2 that are biological, 2 that are mental, and 2 that are moral. These are very different ways of coming at God. Any one of these could be its own argument, and some are purely philosophical, some are purely scientific, some are purely physics, some are purely biology. And look, they all point to the same conclusion. I want you to look at these 8 pieces of evidence another way just for a second. Here they are. Here's the way that naturalists try to explain each piece. Many contradictory explanations, efforts to explain each piece of evidence. This guy does not agree with this guy, who doesn't agree with this guy, who doesn't agree with this guy. Whatever you can say caused this is not the same thing that would cause this. They're not even in the same categories. So now I've got lots of different explanations in an effort to describe 8 pieces of evidence. None of these explanations agree with one another. None of them have anything to do. And the people who hold to one explanation argue against the people who hold to the other explanation. It turns out the same 8 pieces of evidence could be explained by one common causal factor: God. So basically, you have a choice here. Is it this incredibly unlikely array of unrelated causes that explains the 8 pieces of evidence? Or is it the one common causal factor? It turns out physicists have been looking for a theory of everything for years to unify quantum physics to macro physics. Well, there actually is a theory of everything. It's called God. Because that one explanation unifies all the evidence we've looked at tonight. And you don't need a bunch of unlikely, unrelated explanations to get it. One explanation will get it. And that's why we talked about this. And why do I think that we have a problem sometimes? Because let's face it, we're suggesting there's an intruder. And nobody likes somebody who's going to intrude upon their life. It's our desire to not have an intruder that typically keeps us from looking at this evidence to begin with. Nobody likes an intruder. Agreed? But I'm not suggesting that God's really an intruder. Because if this is the universe that he created, he's not the intruder, he's the owner. We are really more like the intruder if you think about it. Yet he's chosen to design the universe for us. And that ought to cause you to think differently about this cause. Remember how he started with two lists of evidence, a list of evidences and a list of explanations? Given this list of evidences, which of these two is the better explanation for those 8 pieces? I don't think you can get it from inside the room. You got to go outside the room. And when we talked about what intruders do, intruders take that sense of curiosity that you had, and it should turn it into a sense of urgency. So here's my whole reason why I did this tonight, why we came out here to do this with your church. Some people will say, well, I don't want to make a decision on this right now because, the science might change in 5 years. Good. Do you think that juries have that option? I'm not going to decide. You showed me a lot of evidence. He looks guilty. But you know what? There might be a piece of evidence that emerges 10 years from now. They'll get him off the hook. Can't vote on him. No. You have to have a sense of urgency to act now. There is enough evidence in the room for anyone to act now. Guys, let me ask you a question, because I'm done. Let me ask you a question. Are you ready to help your students know why this is true? They're going to get these arguments against, they're going to have an alternative explanation given to them in every one of these 8 areas. That is going to happen. We don't come here to show you this stuff to have you walk away unchanged. I'm going to ask you to change. You're the core. You're in this room at 9 o'clock at night listening to this. You must be interested. Where's the rest of the church? Where's the rest of the church with a big C? I ask the same question everywhere I go. Why are you guys Christians? This is the 3 answers I get. Number 1, I was raised in the church. That's the number 1 answer. My parents were Christians, I'm a Christian too. Number 2, I've had an experience that I think was the Holy Spirit or something happened that convinced me this was true. Great. 3rd, I've been transformed by Jesus. Great. Good reasons. They are good reasons. Now, my family's all atheists except my dad remarried, and he's got now a 2nd wife. I have 6 brothers and sisters, all raised Mormon. Those are also the answers that Mormons give in the same order. I do a lot of work with Mormons. You don't think Mormonism is true, yet you want to give me the same answers? The church wants to give me the same answers that Mormons give? Yes, they do. Why? Because they don't know why Christianity is true. They are here by accident. They happen to be in the right place, but they don't know why it's the right place. If you ask me, are you a Californian, Jim? Yes, I'm a Californian. Why? I was born and raised in California. You cannot deny that. Really, Jim? How many counties are in California? I don't know. What's the square mileage of California? I don't know. How much coastline is there in California? I don't know. What's the population of any of the counties in California? I don't know. How do you pass a law in California? I don't know. How's the legislature structured in California? I don't know. What's the founding date of California? I don't know. What's the tree of California, the bird of California, the motto of California? I don't know any of those things. I don't. But I'm a Californian. You couldn't deny that. Is that the way you have been a Christian? Yeah, you're a Christian. You're saved. You trust Christ for your salvation. But don't ask me too many questions. Okay, that might have worked in my dad's or my grandfather's generation, but that will not work for your students in 2015. Trust me. That's why we are shrinking by 1% every year for the last decade. It's going to continue in that direction unless we, as the church, the core that's in this room right now, is willing to affect the change. So
How did they miss this?
A Huntington Beach man is behind bars tonight, accused of a murder more than 30 years ago.
We're looking for the thing that's really hiding in plain sight. Which of these things in this crime scene doesn't fit this scene? For me, this is a calling.
Yeah, I'm clearly an evidentialist. That's just my perspective as a skeptic. That was what I valued, making cases, making criminal cases. So it shouldn't surprise anybody that when I began to examine Christianity, that's the approach I took. I think what we're seeing in the church is that the greater and greater need for case making.
A man is arrested outside his home accused of having a role in the 1981 disappearance of his wife.
Carol vanished 30 years ago, leaving behind her 2 children, Mikey and Brandy.
The family would have been more than happy to believe that Carol is still out there somewhere.
If Carol was dead, if Mike killed her, taking the accusation to court would be risky. But Prosecutor Lewin decided to roll the dice. On April 13th, 2011, Mike was arrested for Carol's murder.
I've learned enough, I think, to be able to help the church do what it needs to do, to understand how evidence is processed, to understand how we put the case together, to understand how powerful the circumstantial case is, but also what we believe about the foundational views we have as Christians in a culture that is becoming more and more non-Christian. Now is the time. This is the time when we need to get serious about how to present it to a culture which is challenging what we believe more and more every day.
Need a speaker for your next conference, retreat, training seminar, or church service? Jim travels around the country, making the case for the existence of God, the deity of Jesus, and the reliability of the Bible. He'd love to partner with you to create a powerful, transformational training experience. Just visit the Cold Case Christianity website and click the Book Me tab. You'll find everything you need to know there, including a list of Jim's speaking topics, promotional materials, Jim's speaking calendar, and a link to connect with our team so we can book your event.
My name is J. Warner Wallace, and I'm a cold case homicide detective. Cold case investigations can teach us a lot about how to investigate the claims of Christianity. Cold case detectives examine events in the distant past for which there are often no living eyewitnesses and little, if any, forensic evidence. The Gospels also record an event in the distant past for which there are no living eyewitnesses and no forensic evidence. The skills I've learned as a cold case detective can help you determine if the Gospels are true. Are the Gospel writers reliable eyewitnesses? Can they be trusted? Has their testimony been corrupted over the years? What can we conclude about Jesus from the Gospel eyewitness accounts? I hope you'll read Cold Case Christianity to discover how evidence is examined and what this evidence tells us about Jesus. Take another look at the claims of Christianity from the perspective of a detective.
Have you ever questioned the resurrection or know someone who has? Follow along with J. Warner Wallace as he examines the most important case in all of history. You'll learn how to think like a cold case detective and share the compelling evidence that Jesus truly is alive. We need to share the good news with those who desperately need to hear it. Will you become a casemaker for Christ? Order Alive in packages of 10 and begin sharing the most important message of all, the truth of the resurrection.
Okay, so there you have it. You've got a couple of things there. I think you've seen how powerful it is when we, as the prosecuting team, can point to one defendant, that guy sitting at the defense table, and say, you know, all of this evidence can be explained by one causal agent, the defendant. Now, it's also possible that he suffered an incredible array of unrelated, disconnected coincidences that just make him look guilty when in fact he's not. he could be that incredibly unlucky. Or it could just be that he's incredibly guilty because he's the one causal explanation that unifies all of the evidence. And you saw we did something very similar here when making the case for what we believe as theists. So I hope this kind of helps you to see the power of showing all the robust, all the diverse evidences, and then showing how we could explain those diverse evidences. And of course, it's keep it simple, stupid. It's Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is almost always the best explanation. And here there is one simple theory of everything, as I said, and that would be, of course, God's existence. A couple takeaway thoughts before we close out this series. I don't know if you've noticed this, and probably you didn't, but I've written 2 books, Cold Case Christianity, which is a book that really centers on eyewitness testimony and how we discover if an eyewitness, how we determine if an eyewitness is reliable. Now, I will tell you that that is a person-centered, a suspect-centered, or a witness-centered approach to working a criminal case. We're going to look at the words that people use. We're going to look at their behaviors. It is suspect-specific. Now, what we did in the second book, God's Crime Scene, is not suspect-specific. It's crime scene specific. It's another way of working a case. I don't know if you know this or not, but when I work my cases, I often employ a gentleman who I've done some work on television with named Mark Safrick. And you can Google him. Mark is a criminal profiler for the FBI. He now has his own agency, and he just consults. But what Mark does is he doesn't take a suspect or witness-centered approach. He takes a crime scene-centered approach. So while I may have a few suspects I'm looking at, or one in particular I'm looking at, when I get Mark involved, I simply say, Mark, do me a favor. Look at this crime scene for me. And then would you please tell me, in this crime scene, and I'm not going to tell you anything about my suspects. I'm not going to tell you much even about my victim. I simply am going to tell you a little bit, but I want nothing about the suspects, but a little bit about the victim. And I want you to look at the crime scene, and just given what you see at the crime scene, tell me the kind of suspect you think I should be looking for. So now, without any idea of who I'm already looking at, Mark looks at the scene and says, wow, you know, you should be looking for a guy who maybe holds a grudge, who's maybe this or that. He's explaining this is definitely not a robbery, this is a targeted murder. He's going to look at all kinds of explanations for the evidence at the scene, but he's not going to know anything specifically about any suspects I'm working. He's just going to develop a suspect profile from evidence at the scene. This is a very different approach. Cold Case Christianity does the suspect or witness-centered approach, top down. And God's Crime Scene does what Mark does. It's bottom up. It's crime scene centered because, of course, we don't know. We're looking to see what kind of suspect would emerge. And you saw this in this last video I just showed you. You can actually describe the suspect in any case given on the evidence, just given the evidence we have at the scene. It develops certain characteristics that we're then looking for when we start looking for our suspect. And this is why this is not a God of the gaps approach. This idea that, you know, people will sometimes say, well, Jim, aren't you really just saying, hey, the naturalistic explanations don't work, therefore God. It's like a God of the gaps. We just stick God in when our natural explanations aren't sufficient. And that, I would think, I would agree. I would have always said before as an atheist that that's a dangerous approach because what that simply does is elevate, you know, if you watch the trajectory of science, it seems that we've been able to often close the gap and get closer and closer to answers in critical areas. We don't attribute, you know, lightning to the Nordic gods throwing down, lightning bolts. We now understand what creates lightning. The more we know about the natural world, the less mystifying it is, and the less we're likely to attribute it to deity. Now, there's some fairness in that, I think. But that's not what we're doing here, because it turns out that as we look at the profile from these 8 pieces of evidence in the universe, it points to something outside the natural realm, no matter how you look at it. This is not a God of the gaps. This is the best explanation in light of the kinds of evidence that direct us to be looking for something that is non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material, that has enough purpose to be guiding something toward a conclusion where there's life in the universe and is a source of intelligent information and creative design that we see in biology, and also acts as a free agent, a mind, which can account for why we have mind and free agency, and also serves as the source of all moral truth and the standard by which we would judge anything to be transcendently evil. We need all of that. We got to have whatever that first cause is. It has to fit the description in all 8 areas. And you'll notice, if you're inclined to believe, for example, that there is a multiverse generator of some natural kind, and of course, how could it be natural? It's not going to involve space, time, or matter. So I'm not sure how you'd even define that. But even if you could just say, okay, fine, there's something out there that's creating a number of multiverses, even though you have no evidence for such a thing, fine. How does that thing also give you mind, free agency, moral truth, and evil, the standard by which we would judge evil? This is the problem. We're looking for one particular kind of suspect. It's not a God of the gaps. It's simply the best and most reasonable inference from evidence. Now, one last thing. Isn't it true that the description of this force, this being, could really fit any theistic worldview? This doesn't seem like it's all that unique to Christianity, to Judaism, to Islam. I mean, if you believe in theism of one stripe or another, doesn't this work in God's crime scene lead you at the foot of theism of any kind? And I think that's true. Although I do think that Yahweh most closely resembles the suspect profile we've offered. I think it's the combination of looking at the evidence in the universe and the historical case for the resurrection that together inclines me to believe that of all the possible theistic worldviews, Christianity happens to be the one that's the most reasonable. And that's why I land as a Christian. All right, I hope this has helped you as you kind of think through the evidence over the last 6 weeks. And of course, I've written about this much more completely in a book called God's Crime Scene, which is available both at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Parable and Lifeway. You name it, it's available everywhere. And it's available in every format everywhere. But in the end, my goal is not to sell you a book as much as it is to help you become a better case maker. So again, as I've said every week, go to coldcasechristianity.com. There are resources there, PDF files you can download. Everything there is free. And it's made available so that you can make the case in your small group, make the case to your church, to your family, to your kids, however you want to be able to use the materials. Please use them. Okay, until next week, I'll see you right here at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.